A rain-soaked black girl waited alone at the luxury hospital entrance. When the respected retired doctor approached her, everyone froze upon discovering the real reason behind her tears. Rain pelted the sidewalk as Charles Thompson pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. His bones ached. At 68, every step reminded him of his age, but he kept walking. The familiar path to St. Michael's Hospital stretched ahead, the same route he'd taken for 43 years. Now, 3 years into retirement, he still couldn't stay away. The automatic doors hissed open and closed. Medical staff rushed in and out, their scrubs barely visible under rain jackets. Charles checked his watch, 2:45 p.m. Right on time for his weekly volunteer shift. Dr. Thompson. A guard waved from his post. Nasty weather today. Charles nodded, raindrops falling from his gray hair. Sure is, Mike. Getting worse by the minute. That's when he saw her. A small figure huddled against the wall, just outside the entrance. A child, no more than 8 or 9, wearing a soaked blue t-shirt and pink sneakers. Water dripped from her black hair, tied in tight braids. Charles stopped. Something wasn't right. Hospital staff streamed past the girl, their eyes forward, pretending not to notice. 2 security guards at the entrance kept glancing her way, whispering to each other. She's been there almost an hour, Mike said, following Charles's gaze. Probably shouldn't be hanging around here. Charles's hands tightened on his umbrella. The girl clutched a piece of paper, now wet and crumpled. Her shoulders shook. From cold or crying, he couldn't tell. A sharp pain hit his chest. 20 years ago, his daughter Emily had worn pink sneakers just like those. Before the cancer. Before everything changed. Has anyone asked if she needs help? Charles's voice came out harder than intended. Mike shrugged. Not our problem, Doc. You know how it is these days. Can't be too careful. A nurse hurried past, splashing through a puddle. The girl flinched as water sprayed her legs, but the nurse didn't even look back. Charles watched another doctor walk by, then a group of medical students. None stopped. None even slowed down. He'd seen this before, countless times during his career. It was easier to look away, to pretend someone else would handle it. The girl wiped her face with a wet sleeve. Her paper, whatever it was falling apart in her hands. Should we call security? Mike reached for his radio. Charles stepped forward. No, I'll handle this. His legs moved before his mind caught up. Each step brought back memories. Emily in hospital beds. Emily asking why people stared at her bald head. Emily's last smile. He promised himself after losing her that he'd never ignore a child in need again. The girl looked up as his shadow fell over her. Fear flashed across her face. The kind of fear Charles had seen too many times in his career. The fear of being unwanted, unwelcome. You're getting soaked out here, he said, moving his umbrella to cover her. I'm Dr. Thompson. What's your name? She pressed herself harder against the wall. Her eyes darted to the security guards, then back to Charles. Sarah, she whispered, barely audible over the rain. Charles crouched down, his knees protesting. The paper in her hands was a hospital address, the ink running down the page. That looks important, he said, keeping his voice gentle. Are you trying to find someone? Sarah nodded, her lower lip trembling. My mama. She got sick at work. Her voice cracked. They gave me this paper, but... She looked at the hospital entrance, then down at her shoes. I walked here, but they won't let me in alone. Charles felt the weight of stares on his back. He knew what they were thinking, what he might have thought himself, years ago. A black child, alone, probably making trouble. The same assumptions he'd seen destroy lives throughout his career. How long have you been waiting? Don't know. Sarah hugged herself tighter. The bus didn't come. I walked. Then it started raining, and... She swallowed hard. Everyone keeps looking at me weird. Like I'm bad. The rain drummed harder on Charles's umbrella. Behind them, he heard Mike speaking into his radio. Time was running out before someone decided to handle the situation. Charles straightened up, his decision made. Well, Sarah, you're in luck. I worked in this hospital for 40 years, and I still volunteer here. What do you say we find your mother together? Sarah's eyes widened. Really? You'll help me? Of course. Charles held out his hand. No one should have to wait in the rain alone. Sarah hesitated, studying his face. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his offered hand. Her fingers were ice cold. As they walked toward the entrance, Charles heard Mike's sharp intake of breath. The security guards straightened up, hands moving to their belts. "Dr. Thompson," one started. "Is there a problem here?" Charles felt Sarah's hand tighten in his. He thought of all the times he'd walked past similar scenes, all the assumptions he'd made, all the help he hadn't given. "No problem," he said firmly. "This young lady needs to find her mother. I'm escorting her inside." The guard's eyes narrowed. "Sir, we have protocols about unaccompanied minors." "She's not unaccompanied." Charles squeezed Sarah's hand gently. "She's with me." They walked through the doors together, leaving the rain and the stairs behind. Sarah's wet shoes squeaked on the polished floor. She stayed close to Charles's side, her small hand still gripping his tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. Charles looked down at her, seeing not just Sarah, but every child he'd ever walked past, every assumption he'd ever made, every time he'd looked away. "Let's find your mother," he said, leading her toward the information desk. "And maybe after that, we can talk about why you're so interested in all these medical machines I see you looking at." Sarah's face lit up, just a little, and Charles felt something he hadn't felt in years, the simple joy of doing what was right, no matter what anyone else thought. The real journey was just beginning. The hospital lobby hummed with activity. Sarah's wet shoes left small puddles on the floor as she walked beside Charles, her hand still gripping his tightly. At the information desk, a receptionist looked up, her eyes moving from Charles to Sarah, then back again. "Dr. Thompson," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Is everything all right? We need to locate this young lady's mother." Charles kept his voice steady, professional. "She's an employee here, cleaning staff, I believe." Sarah nodded, holding up her crumpled paper. "Her name's Maya Williams. She got sick at work." The receptionist's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "I'm sorry, but without proper guardian authorization." "Linda." Charles leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This child walked 40 minutes in the rain to find her sick mother. Surely we can help." Linda glanced at her computer screen, then at Sarah's dripping clothes. "Hospital policy clearly states." "I understand policy." Charles felt Sarah's hand tighten in his. "I helped write many of them during my time here. But sometimes we need to see the person behind the policy." A security guard approached, radio crackling. "Dr. Thompson? We need to verify. My mama works in the Douglas building," Sarah interrupted, her voice small but clear. "She cleans offices there. They gave me this paper when she got sick." She held out the wet address slip again, her hand shaking slightly. Charles watched Linda's face soften almost imperceptibly. 20 years of working reception had taught her to spot trouble, but also genuine need. "Let me make a few calls," Linda said finally, reaching for her phone. While they waited, Charles noticed Sarah shivering. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It engulfed her small frame, but at least it was dry. "You like hospitals?" he asked, noticing her eyes darting around the lobby, taking in every detail. Sarah nodded. "I watch medical shows sometimes. When Mama lets me." She pointed to a passing crash cart. "That's for emergencies, right? Like when someone's heart stops." Charles raised his eyebrows. "That's right. How did you know that?" "TV. And books from the library." Sarah's voice grew more animated. "I read about stethoscopes too. And how doctors can hear what's wrong inside you." A memory hit Charles, Emily at 8 years old, sitting on his lap while he explained his medical textbooks. She'd had the same curiosity, the same spark in her eyes. Linda's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Your mother's in the emergency department, sweetie. They are running some tests." Sarah's face paled. "Is she okay?" "She's stable," Linda assured her. "But..." She looked at Charles apologetically. "We still can't allow an unaccompanied minor." "I'll escort her," Charles said firmly. "I'm a retired physician with full privileges here. I'll take full responsibility." The security guard stepped closer. "Sir, in light of recent incidents..." "What incidents?" Charles turned to face him. "Be specific. What exactly are you implying?" The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Just following protocol, sir." "Then follow this protocol. I'm Dr. Charles Thompson, former chief of medicine at this hospital. I'm vouching for this child. Is that clear enough?" A tense moment passed. Then the guard nodded stiffly and stepped back. "Come on, Sarah." Charles guided her toward the elevators. Let's find your mother. In the elevator, Sarah looked up at him. Why were they being mean? Charles's throat tightened. How do you explain decades of institutional prejudice to an 8-year-old? How do you tell her that the color of her skin made people jump to conclusions he himself had made countless times in his career? Sometimes, he said carefully, people forget to see what's really important. They get caught up in rules and forget about kindness. Like when kids at school say I can't play with them. Charles felt that familiar ache in his chest. Yes, like that. The elevator doors opened to the controlled chaos of the emergency department. Nurses rushed past with charts, doctors called out orders, and somewhere in the distance, a monitor beeped steadily. Sarah's grip on Charles's hand tightened. It's loud. It can be overwhelming, Charles agreed. But everyone here is working to help people get better. They approached the nurse's station, where a young nurse was updating charts. Excuse me, Charles said. We're looking for Maya Williams. The nurse looked up, her eyes widening slightly. Dr. Thompson? I didn't know you were on duty today. I'm not. I'm helping this young lady find her mother. Understanding dawned on the nurse's face as she looked at Sarah. Oh, you're Maya's daughter? She's been asking for you. Bay 12, just around the corner. As they walked toward Bay 12, Sarah suddenly stopped. What if she's really sick? Charles knelt down, ignoring his protesting knees. Listen to me, Sarah. Your mother is in the best possible place. We have excellent doctors and nurses here. And you're very brave for finding your way here to be with her. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I was scared. Outside. Nobody would help me. I know. Charles felt a deep shame for every time he'd walked past someone in need. But you're not alone anymore. Ready to see your mom? Sarah wiped her eyes with his coat sleeve and nodded. They turned the corner to Bay 12, where Maya Williams lay on a hospital bed, and 4 in her arm. Her eyes were closed, but they flew open at the sound of approaching footsteps. Sarah. Maya tried to sit up. Baby, how did you? She stopped, taking in her daughter's wet clothes and Charles's oversized coat. Mama! Sarah rushed forward, still holding Charles's hand, pulling him along. Maya's eyes met Charles's, confusion and gratitude mixing in her expression. Who? Dr. Thompson, he said softly. I found your daughter waiting in the rain. She was very worried about you. Maya reached for Sarah's hand. You walked here? In this weather? Oh, baby. I had to find you, Sarah said, her voice muffled against her mother's hospital gown. Are you okay? Just dehydrated and exhausted, Maya explained, shooting a grateful look at Charles. They're giving me fluids. I'll be fine. Charles watched them embrace, feeling like an intruder in a private moment. He turned to leave, but Sarah's voice stopped him. Dr. Thompson. She looked at him, still wearing his coat. Thank you for helping me. Maya nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes, thank you. Most people wouldn't have. Most people should, Charles said simply. I'm just glad I could help. As he walked away, he heard Sarah asking her mother about the 4 bag, explaining how it helped with dehydration. He smiled, remembering Emily's endless questions, her desire to understand everything. Maybe, he thought, some good could come from all this. Maybe helping one child could begin to make up for all those he'd failed to help before. But first, he had some things to discuss with hospital administration about their policies on unaccompanied minors. It was time for some changes. Charles sat in the hospital's administrative office, his back straight despite his exhaustion. Across the desk, Patricia Morton, the hospital administrator, reviewed the incident report with pursed lips. Dr. Thompson, she began, placing the paper down. While we appreciate your years of service here, you must understand the liability concerns. The only liability I see, Charles replied, is leaving a child alone in the rain. Patricia sighed. We have protocols. I helped write those protocols, Patricia. 30 years ago. Charles leaned forward. They need updating. Times have changed. We can't just let anyone. She wasn't anyone. She was a frightened child looking for her sick mother. The office door opened, and Dr. James Chen, the current chief of medicine, entered. His presence brought back memories. Charles had mentored him during his residency 20 years ago. Charles, James nodded, taking a seat. I heard about what happened in the ED. Then you know we need to address this. James exchanged glances with Patricia. The security team was following standard procedure. Standard procedure. Charles felt his patience wearing thin. Tell me, James, if it had been your daughter standing there. That's different, Patricia interjected. Why? Charles's voice cut through the air. Because she'd be wearing expensive clothes? Because she'd arrive in a car instead of walking? Because she'd look like she belongs here. Uncomfortable silence filled the room. Outside, the rain continued to fall. You know that's not what we meant, James said quietly. Then what did you mean? Charles pulled out Sarah's wet hospital address slip, now dried but crumpled. This child had official documentation. She had a legitimate reason to be here. But because of how she looked, because of assumptions we made, she was treated like a threat. Patricia shifted in her chair. Dr. Thompson, no one is suggesting. I watched that girl for 15 minutes, Charles continued. I counted 37 people who walked past her. Medical professionals, sworn to help others, who chose to look away. We can't help everyone who shows up at our door, James argued. She wasn't at our door. She was our responsibility. Charles stood up, his hands pressed against the desk. Her mother works here. She cleans the offices where we make these grand policies about patient care. And when her child needed help, we failed her. The words hung in the air. Charles remembered similar conversations from his time as chief of medicine. Always reasons, always protocols, always excuses for maintaining the status quo. What do you propose? James asked finally. A new policy. Clear guidelines for helping minors locate family members in the hospital. A proper check-in system at security. Training for staff on recognizing and addressing bias. Charles paused. And I want to start a mentorship program. Patricia raised an eyebrow. Mentorship? For children like Sarah. Kids who show interest in medicine but might never get the opportunity to pursue it. Charles thought of Sarah's questions about the medical equipment, her eager curiosity. We talk about diversity in healthcare, but we keep building barriers instead of bridges. James leaned back, studying his former mentor. You're really serious about this. I've never been more serious. Charles met his gaze. I spent 40 years in this hospital. I've seen things change, but not enough. Not where it matters. It's not that simple, Patricia began. It is that simple. Charles's voice softened. Yesterday, I made a choice. I chose to help instead of look away. That's all any of us need to do. Just choose differently. A knock at the door interrupted them. Linda from reception entered, holding a drawing. Sorry to interrupt, but the little girl from yesterday? She came back with her mother to return Dr. Thompson's coat. Linda held up the paper. She made this. Charles took the drawing. It showed two stick figures, one small, one tall, standing under an umbrella in the rain. Above them, in careful child's handwriting, "Thank you for helping me find Mama." James stood up and looked at the drawing over Charles's shoulder. His expression changed, softened. Maybe, he said slowly, we could start with the mentorship program. As a pilot initiative. Patricia opened her mouth to object, then closed it. She looked at the drawing, then at Charles. Draft a proposal, she said finally. Include your recommendations for policy changes. We'll review it next week. Charles nodded, carefully folding the drawing and putting it in his pocket. I'll have it on your desk tomorrow morning. As he left the office, he heard James behind him. Charles? Why this girl? Why now? Charles turned back. Because 20 years ago, my daughter asked me why people looked away when she was sick. I never had a good answer for her. Maybe now I can help make sure other children don't have to ask that question. He walked through the hospital corridors, past the spot where he'd first seen Sarah. The rain had stopped, but puddles still dotted the sidewalk. A young mother walked past with two children, and this time, the security guard smiled and held the door. Small changes. That's how it started. Back in his home office that evening, Charles began writing his proposal. His phone buzzed, a text from Maya Williams. Sarah can't stop talking about the hospital equipment you explained to her. She wants to be a doctor now. Charles smiled, thinking of another little girl who once had the same dream. He opened a new document and typed, Proposal, St. Michael's Hospital Youth Mentorship Program. Sometimes the hardest barriers to break were the ones we built ourselves. But they could be broken, one choice at a time. He looked at Sarah's drawing again, now pinned to his bulletin board. Tomorrow, he would start making those choices count. 2 weeks after the rainy day incident, Charles stood in the hospital's main lobby, checking his watch. 3:45 p.m. Sarah would arrive soon for their first official mentoring session. The new policies sat fresh on his desk upstairs: emergency protocols for unaccompanied minors, bias training requirements, and the pilot mentorship program. But paper was one thing. Real change happened in moments like this. Dr. Thompson. Sarah's voice cut through the lobby noise. She ran toward him, backpack bouncing, Maya following more slowly behind. "You're early," Charles smiled. "Ready to learn about medicine?" Sarah nodded eagerly. "I read a whole book about the human body from the library." Maya approached, looking tired but better than she had in the ER. "She hasn't talked about anything else for days. Are you sure this isn't too much trouble?" "Not at all." Charles gestured toward the elevators. "Shall we begin our tour?" Sarah grabbed his hand automatically, a habit formed from their first meeting. The simple trust in that gesture still caught him off guard. "First stop," Charles announced as they entered the elevator, the cardiac wing. The doors opened to a quieter floor. Medical equipment beeped steadily. A nurse pushing an ECG machine nodded as they passed. "What's that?" Sarah pointed. "That's an electrocardiogram, ECG for short. It records the electrical signals from your heart." Charles stopped. "Want to see how it works?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Can we?" The nurse, Jenny, whom Charles had known for years, smiled. "I was just taking it for routine maintenance. Want to try it out?" They entered an empty examination room. Sarah climbed onto the bed, watching intently as Jenny attached the leads. "Now stay very still," Jenny instructed. The machine hummed to life, paper feeding through with spiky lines. "That's my heart," Sarah whispered. "Those lines show how your heart is beating." Charles pointed to the pattern. "See these peaks? That's your heart muscle contracting. Like a pump." "Exactly. You've been studying." Maya watched from the doorway, her eyes glistening. She's never been this excited about anything before. They continued through the hospital. Sarah asked about everything: the 4 pumps, the pulse oximeters, the crash carts. Each question brought back memories of Emily, but now they came with less pain, more purpose. In the radiology department, they met Dr. Rivera, reviewing x-rays. "Want to see something cool?" she asked Sarah, pulling up a chest x-ray. "This is what your lungs look like." Sarah stared at the image. "Those dark spaces, that's where the air goes." "Very good." Dr. Rivera looked impressed. "Who taught you that?" "I read it in a book." "And?" Sarah glanced at Charles. "Dr. Thompson explained some things when we were waiting for Mema." Charles remembered that day, answering her questions about the medical equipment in the ER. He hadn't realized how much she'd absorbed. Their next stop was the laboratory. Through the observation window, Sarah watched technicians process samples. "This is where we learn what's making people sick," Charles explained. "Like solving a mystery. How do you know what to look for?" "That's where knowledge and experience come in. See that microscope? It lets us see things too small for our eyes." A commotion down the hall interrupted them. A trauma team rushed past with a patient on a gurney. Sarah pressed against the wall, but her eyes followed their movements intently. "They're so fast," she whispered. "They have to be. In emergencies, every second counts." "Is that what you did? Help in emergencies?" Charles nodded. "For many years. It's hard work, but when you save someone's life—" "I want to do that," Sarah said firmly. "I want to help people like that." Maya squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Baby, being a doctor, it's not easy. It takes a lot of school, a lot of money." "That's what the mentorship program is for," Charles interjected. "To help break down those barriers. If Sarah's willing to work hard, there are always ways." They reached the pediatric ward. Colorful murals brightened the walls, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from the playroom. "This," Charles said quietly, "was my favorite place to work." Sarah touched a painted butterfly on the wall. "Even when kids are really sick. Especially then. Children have an amazing capacity to heal, to hope." He thought of Emily's last days in this ward. "They teach us as much as we teach them." A young resident approached, tablet in hand. "Dr. Thompson, I heard you were starting a mentorship program. Any spots still open?" Charles looked at Sarah, then back at the resident. "Actually, I could use some help." "Dr. Harrison, meet Sarah. She's interested in emergency medicine." The resident's face lit up. "Really? That's my specialty. Want to hear about the craziest case I had last week? They spent the next hour in the doctor's lounge, Sarah absorbing every word as Dr. Harrison explained various cases. Her questions were specific, thoughtful. She wasn't just interested, she was understanding. Time to go, baby, Maya said eventually. Dr. Thompson has other things to do. Actually, Charles said, I have something for Sarah. He pulled out a child-sized white coat from his office. On the pocket was embroidered, Sarah Williams, future doctor. Sarah's hands shook as she took it. Really? For me? Every doctor starts somewhere. Charles helped her put it on. It fit perfectly. Remember, this is just the beginning. Maya wiped her eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Thank me by supporting her dreams. Charles watched Sarah examine her reflection in the window. She has the mind for medicine. The heart too. As they walked back to the lobby, Sarah kept touching the coat's pocket, as if making sure it was real. Other staff members smiled as they passed, some stopping to introduce themselves to the new doctor. Same time next week? Charles asked at the entrance. Sarah hugged him suddenly, fierce and quick. Thank you, she whispered. Charles watched them leave, Sarah still wearing her white coat. A security guard gave her a high five as she passed. Back in his office, he found Emily's old medical books, the ones he'd kept but couldn't bear to open. Maybe it was time to pass them on, to let them inspire another young mind. Sometimes the best way to heal old wounds was to help prevent new ones. One small future doctor at a time. 1 month into their mentoring sessions, Charles received an urgent call from Maya. Sarah had a high fever and wasn't responding to over-the-counter medication. Could he meet them at the ER? Charles found them in the waiting room. Sarah lay across 2 chairs, her head in Maya's lap, still wearing her treasured white coat despite being sick. Dr. Thompson, Maya stood, relief clear on her face. I'm sorry to bother you, but never apologize for caring about your child. Charles knelt beside Sarah. Hey, kiddo, not feeling so good? Sarah's eyes fluttered open. My head hurts, and I'm cold. Her voice was weak, but she managed a small smile. Is this what they mean by doctor? Heal thyself, ? Charles chuckled despite his concern. Been reading those medical history books I gave you? I see. He pressed a hand to her forehead. That's quite a fever. Let's get you checked out. He approached the triage nurse, his former status at the hospital smoothing their path. Soon, they were in an examination room. Sarah perched on the bed while a young doctor examined her. Looks like a nasty case of flu, Dr. Peters said, checking Sarah's throat. We'll run some tests to be sure. Sarah watched intently as the doctor drew blood. That's going to the lab, right? Like where we saw them testing samples. Dr. Peters raised an eyebrow. You know about the lab? Dr. Thompson showed me. They use microscopes and centrifuges and... Sarah's voice trailed off as she shivered. Try to rest your voice, Charles advised. Want me to explain what they are testing for? Sarah nodded, pulling her white coat tighter around her shoulders. As they waited for results, Charles described each test, what it looked for, and why it mattered. Even sick, Sarah asked questions between shivers. The CBC, complete blood count, will tell us about your white blood cells, he explained. If they are elevated, it confirms your body's fighting an infection. Like an army. Sarah's voice was hoarse. Exactly like an army. Your white blood cells are your body's soldiers. Maya watched them from her chair. She insists on wearing that coat everywhere. Even to school sometimes. They let her? Charles asked. Her science teacher encourages it. Says Sarah's been teaching the class medical terms. Pride swelled in Charles's chest. In just a month, Sarah had devoured every medical book he'd given her, asking for more. She'd even started a doctor's notebook, where she wrote down new terms and concepts. Dr. Peters returned with results. Definitely influenza. We'll start you on antivirals and keep you overnight for observation since your fever's so high. Sarah's face fell. But tomorrow's Thursday. We have our hospital tour scheduled. There'll be other Thursdays, Charles assured her. Right now, you need to rest. They moved to a private room in pediatrics. Sarah's eyes lit up despite her illness when she recognized the butterfly mural. My favorite ward, she whispered, echoing Charles's words from their first tour. As nurses set up 4 fluids, Sarah explained to her mother how each medication worked. Maya shook her head in amazement. A month ago, She could barely say stethoscope. She murmured to Charles. Now listen to her. Charles watched Sarah correct the nurse's pronunciation of acetaminophen and felt a familiar ache. Emily had done the same thing, teaching her nurses about medications even as they treated her. Night fell. Maya dozed in a chair while Sarah drifted in and out of sleep. Charles stayed, watching her fever readings slowly decline. Dr. Thompson. Sarah's voice was barely audible. Yes. Tell me about when you decided to be a doctor. Charles settled into his chair. Well, it started when I was about your age. My grandfather got sick. He told her about watching doctors work to save his grandfather, about deciding then that he wanted to help people the same way. Sarah listened, fighting sleep. Were you scared? She asked. When you started? Terrified. Medicine isn't easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Some kids at school say I can't be a doctor. Because we're poor. Because I'm. She trailed off. Charles felt that familiar anger rise. Sarah, look at me. He waited until her fever-bright eyes met his. There will always be people who say you can't. Your job isn't to listen to them. It's to prove them wrong. Like you did with the security guards, when they didn't want to let me in. Exactly like that. Charles adjusted her foreline. You know, when I started medical school, some people didn't want me there either. Said I was too old, should have started younger. But you did it anyway. I did it anyway. And now I'm helping you do it too. Sarah smiled weakly. I'm going to be a good doctor. Like you, you're going to be a better doctor than me. The night passed slowly. Charles taught Sarah how to read her own vital signs on the monitor. She fell asleep reciting normal temperature ranges, her white coat tucked around her like a blanket. Maya woke at dawn. You stayed all night? Charles, you didn't have to. I wanted to. He checked Sarah's latest temperature reading. Almost normal. The antivirals are working. It's not just the medicine working. Maya watched her daughter sleep. It's having someone believe in her. Before you. I didn't know how to help her dream this big. Dreams should be big, Charles said. Otherwise, they're not worth fighting for. Dr. Peters arrived for morning rounds. Sarah woke up enough to ask about her lab results, impressing the doctor with her understanding of white blood cell counts. She's going to be quite a doctor someday, Dr. Peters remarked to Charles. Charles nodded. Yes, she is. And we're going to make sure she has every opportunity to get there. Sarah was discharged that afternoon, her fever gone but her enthusiasm undiminished. She insisted on keeping her bandaged to document the experience in her medical notebook. Next Thursday, she asked Charles as they left. Next Thursday, he promised, but only if you rest and take all your medication. I will. Doctor's orders. Right. Charles watched them drive away, Sarah's white coat visible through the car window. He thought about all the barriers she would face, all the people who would try to dim her dreams. But he also thought about her strength, her determination, her brilliant mind that absorbed medical knowledge like a sponge. And he knew that sometimes the greatest medicine wasn't found in pills or injections. Sometimes it was found in believing in someone when no one else would. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy. 6 kids in miniature white coats sat around the large table, with Sarah among them. Charles stood at the front, officially launching St. Michael's Youth Mentorship Program. Welcome, future doctors, he began. You're here because you've shown exceptional interest in medicine. Sarah sat up straighter, her notebook already open. Next to her, a boy with thick glasses raised his hand. Dr. Thompson, my mom said this program never existed before. Why now? Charles met Sarah's eyes briefly. Because someone showed me that talent and passion don't always come with opportunity. We're here to change that. Dr. Harrison, who had volunteered to help, started distributing materials. Each of you will be paired with a mentor. You'll learn basic medical concepts, observe hospital operations, and begin preparing for a future in medicine. A girl at the end of the table frowned. But we're just kids. Every doctor was just a kid once, Charles replied. Sarah, want to share what you've learned in the past month? Sarah stood, clutching her medical notebook. Well, I learned about cardiac monitoring, basic lab procedures, and different types of diagnostic tools. Last week, I had the flu and got to experience patient care firsthand. I monitored my own vital signs and the other children listened with growing interest as Sarah explained medical terms with surprising confidence. Charles noticed their expressions changing from skepticism to curiosity. Maya, watching from the doorway with other parents, wiped her eyes. After the orientation, Charles met with each family individually. Many had similar stories: bright kids, big dreams, limited resources. One mother worked 2 jobs. Another father was studying English at night school. "We can't afford medical school," they said, again and again. "That's why we start now," Charles explained. "There are scholarships, programs, opportunities. But first, we give them the foundation." Later that afternoon, he found Sarah in the hospital library, surrounded by medical journals. "Heavy reading?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I'm researching pediatric oncology." She hesitated. "Because of Emily." Charles felt his chest tighten. "How did you know about Emily?" "I heard some nurses talking. They said you started this program because you lost your daughter to cancer." Sarah met his eyes. "Is that why you helped me that day?" "Because of her." Charles was quiet for a moment. "I helped you because it was right. But yes, Emily, she's part of why I understand how important this is. Tell me about her." Charles pulled out his wallet, removing a worn photo. Emily at 8, grinning despite her bald head, wearing a doctor's coat like Sarah's. She wanted to be a doctor too. Even in the hospital, she studied, said she'd find a cure for her own cancer. His voice cracked. "She fought so hard." Sarah touched the photo gently. "She looked brave. She was like you." "Did it hurt?" "Helping me, because I reminded you of her." "At first," Charles admitted. "But now it feels right. Like maybe this is what Emily would have wanted. Helping other children reach the dream she couldn't." Sarah was quiet, thinking. Then she opened her notebook, showing pages of careful notes. "I want to learn everything. Not just for me, but for Emily too. Is that okay?" Charles felt tears prick his eyes. "That's more than okay." The mentorship program grew. Charles watched Sarah take younger students under her wing, explaining concepts she'd learned, sharing her enthusiasm. She had Emily's gift for making complex things simple. One evening, after a particularly successful session where Sarah had taught the group about stethoscopes, Maya pulled Charles aside. "She's different now," Maya said. "Stronger, more confident. The other day, a kid at school said she couldn't be a doctor because we live in the poor part of town. Know what she did?" "What?" "Gave him a lecture on socioeconomic barriers in medical education and how programs like this are changing things." "Used those exact words." Maya laughed. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he shut up quick. Charles smiled, remembering Emily doing something similar. "She's going to change things, Maya. Not just for herself, because you believed in her first." Later that night, Charles added to his own notebook, not medical notes, but observations about each student. Sarah's entry was longest: natural teacher, strong diagnostic instincts, exceptional empathy, reminds me daily why medicine matters. He looked at Emily's photo on his desk. "You'd like her," he said softly. "She has your spirit." The mentorship program expanded to other hospitals. Charles received calls from administrators across the country, asking how to implement similar initiatives. "It's simple," he told them. "Stop seeing barriers. Start seeing potential." 6 months into the program, Sarah gave her first presentation to hospital staff about the importance of pediatric care from a child's perspective. She stood at the podium in her white coat, speaking with the confidence of someone twice her age. "Medicine isn't just about treating symptoms," she concluded. "It's about seeing the person. Dr. Thompson taught me that, and now I'm teaching others." The audience applauded. Charles watched from the back, remembering that rainy day that started it all. One choice, one moment of seeing past barriers, had created ripples he never expected. After the presentation, Sarah found him in his office. "Did I do okay?" she asked, suddenly just a nervous 8-year-old again. "You did better than okay. You showed them exactly why this program matters." Sarah fingered the embroidery on her coat. "I've been thinking, when I become a doctor, I want to start programs like this everywhere, so no kid has to wait in the rain." Charles thought of Emily's last words to him. "Make it matter, Dad." "We'll do it together," he promised Sarah. "One future doctor at a time." She hugged him, then ran off to share her presentation notes with the other students. Charles watched her go, seeing not just Sarah, not just Emily, but all the children who needed someone to believe in them. Sometimes the best medicine wasn't found in hospitals at all. Sometimes it was found in the simple act of opening doors that others thought should stay closed. 10 years passed like turning pages in a medical textbook. Sarah grew from a curious 8-year-old into a determined 18-year-old. Her white coat, now worn and faded, hung preserved in a display case at St. Michael's alongside photos of hundreds of other children who'd followed her path through the mentorship program. Charles sat in his usual spot in the hospital cafeteria, reviewing Sarah's college applications. His hands shook slightly as he read her personal statement. 10 years ago, I sat in the rain outside this hospital, afraid and alone. Today, I walk these halls preparing for my own future in medicine, thanks to one doctor who chose to see me instead of looking away. Is that coffee fresh? Sarah's voice interrupted his reading. She dropped into the chair across from him, wearing her new volunteer uniform. You're early for your shift, Charles noted, checking his watch. Wanted to review my applications one more time. She pulled out a thick folder. Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Stanford. I still can't believe I'm applying. Believe it. Your grades are exceptional, your recommendations are stellar, and your experience here. Speaking of experience, Sarah interrupted, grinning. Guess who helped diagnose a case in the ER yesterday? Charles raised an eyebrow. Do tell. Little boy came in with weird symptoms. Dr. Harrison was stumped. But I remembered that case study you showed me last month about rare tropical diseases. Asked if the family had traveled recently. Turns out they just got back from Brazil. And dengue fever. Dr. Harrison said he wouldn't have caught it so quick without my question. Sarah beamed. 10 years of your training paying off? Charles remembered a similar conversation with Emily, her excitement over her first correct diagnosis. But now the memory brought warmth instead of pain. Dr. Thompson. Sarah's voice turned serious. Mom wanted me to ask about the medical school applications. The costs. Already handled. Charles pulled out another folder. Remember all those hospital fundraisers you spoke at? The mentorship program has a scholarship fund now. Full ride for students who complete the program and get accepted to medical school. Sarah's eyes widened. But that's impossible. The amount of money? Nothing's impossible. You taught me that. Charles smiled. The fund is called the Emily Thompson Memorial Scholarship. The board approved it last week. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. You never talk about her much. Emily, I talk about her every day, through this program. Through you? Charles touched the folder. She would have been about your age now. Sarah reached across the table, squeezing his hand. A code blue announcement interrupted the moment, and she jumped up. That's my floor. Got to go. She grabbed her files and rushed off, nearly colliding with Dr. Harrison. Careful, future doctor, he called after her. Charles watched her go, remembering the shy girl from a decade ago. Now she moved through the hospital with confidence, known and respected by staff at every level. The mentorship program had grown beyond his wildest dreams. What started with 6 nervous kids now served hundreds across multiple hospitals. Sarah had become its unofficial ambassador, proving what was possible when barriers fell. He found Maya in the hospital coffee shop later that day. She'd moved up from cleaning staff to patient services coordinator, inspired by her daughter's journey. Harvard, Maya whispered, staring at the application. My baby might go to Harvard. She'll get in, Charles said confidently. All of them will want her. Because of you. Maya wiped her eyes. That day in the rain, if you hadn't stopped. If I hadn't stopped, someone else would have. Eventually. No. Maya's voice was firm. They wouldn't. You know they wouldn't. You changed everything that day. Charles thought about change, how it could come suddenly like rain or slowly like growing up. Sarah had changed him as much as he'd changed her. Later that afternoon, he watched her lead a group of new mentorship students through the pediatric ward. She wore her volunteer badge like others might wear Olympic medals. See this butterfly mural, she told them. My first night as a patient, Dr. Thompson taught me about white blood cells right here. Called them my body's army. The children hung on her every word, just as she had once hung on his. Each wore a white coat. Each carried a notebook. Each represented another barrier broken. In his office, Charles updated the program statistics. Over 1,000 students served. 86% went on to college. 32 currently in medical school. 4 graduated and starting residencies. Sarah knocked on his door. Emergency in pediatrics. 8-year-old with mysterious symptoms. Dr. Harrison wants our opinion. Our opinion? Well, your opinion. But I get to observe and take notes. She grinned. Come on, Dr. Thompson. Time to teach me something new. As they walked to pediatrics, staff members greeted them warmly. No security guards questioned their presence. No one looked away. The scared little boy in the examination room reminded Charles of Sarah 10 years ago. But this time, when she knelt beside him in her volunteer uniform, she knew exactly what to say. Hey there. I was a patient here once too. Want to learn something cool about hospitals while the doctors figure out what's wrong? The boy nodded. Sarah pulled out her ever-present notebook. See this doctor here? He taught me everything I know. And one day, I'm going to be just like him. Want to know how hospitals work? Charles stepped back, watching her work her magic. In her voice, he heard echoes of Emily. In her dedication, he saw his own passion for medicine renewed. Sometimes the best teaching happened without words. Sometimes the greatest healing came from breaking down walls rather than building them. And sometimes, on rainy days when the world seemed dark, all it took was one person willing to stop and offer an umbrella to change not just one life, but countless others. Sarah looked up from her patient, caught Charles's eye, and smiled. In that smile, he saw the future of medicine, more compassionate, more inclusive, more human. All because of a choice made in the rain. The Harvard Medical School acceptance letter arrived on a rainy Thursday. Charles got the call from Maya first, her voice choked with tears. She did it. My baby did it. Sarah burst into his office an hour later, still in her volunteer uniform, waving the letter. We did it. Charles stood, arms open, and she rushed into them like she was 8 years old again. I never doubted you for a second. Full scholarship, she said into his shoulder. The Emily Thompson Memorial Fund. I promise I'll make it count. You already have. The next 4 years passed in a blur of phone calls, video chats, and holiday visits. Sarah excelled at Harvard, just as she had in everything else. Her professors noted her exceptional bedside manner, her natural teaching ability, her way of explaining complex concepts to patients. I learned from the best, she'd tell them. Now, standing in St. Michael's lobby on another rainy day, Charles waited for Sarah again. But this time, she wasn't coming as a volunteer or a student. Today was her first day as Dr. Sarah Williams, resident physician. She walked through the doors in her new white coat, and for a moment, Charles saw double. The scared 8-year-old in the rain overlapped with the confident young doctor she'd become. Dr. Thompson. She hugged him tight. Ready to show me the ropes? Again. Actually, he smiled. I think you'll be showing me. They walked the familiar corridors, but now Sarah moved with professional purpose. Staff members who'd known her as a child did double takes at her new title. Dr. Williams. Dr. Harrison approached. Your first case is waiting in the ER. Want to handle it? Sarah straightened her coat. What do we have? 8-year-old girl. Came in alone. Security called up about her. Charles watched Sarah's expression change. Alone. They hurried to the ER. Near the entrance, a small girl sat huddled in a chair, clutching a crumpled paper. Security guards hovered nearby, uncertain. Hi there. Sarah knelt in front of the girl. I'm Dr. Williams. What's your name? Maria, the girl whispered. My dad, he got hurt at work. They gave me this address. But Sarah looked at the security guards, then back at Maria. You're scared to go in alone. Maria nodded. Well, you know what? Sarah smiled. The exact same thing happened to me when I was your age. Right here, in this same spot. Want to know what happened next? She told Maria about that rainy day, about Charles, about how one moment changed everything. As she spoke, Charles watched the security guard's expression soften. So how about we find your dad together? Sarah held out her hand. No one should have to wait alone. Maria took her hand, and they walked into the ER. Charles followed, remembering another such walk, 10 years ago. Later, after Maria's father had been treated for a minor workplace injury, Sarah found Charles in his office. I need your help with something, she said. Remember that family support program I talked about in medical school? The one to prevent situations like Maria's. I remember. I want to implement it here. Starting today, she spread out papers on his desk. Clear protocols for unaccompanied minors. transport assistance for families, community outreach. Charles picked up the proposal. On top was a familiar drawing, two stick figures under an umbrella in the rain. You kept it all these years. It reminds me why I'm here. Sarah sat down. The mentorship program changed my life. But we need to do more. We need to change the whole system. They worked late into the night, refining the proposal. Other staff members dropped by, adding suggestions. Dr. Harrison brought coffee. Even the security guards contributed ideas. At midnight, Sarah stood at the window, watching the city lights. Sometimes I wonder, what if you hadn't stopped that day? What if you'd walked past like everyone else? I couldn't, Charles said simply. Because of Emily. Tell me more about her, please. Charles pulled out his wallet, removing the worn photo he always carried. She was diagnosed at 7. Spent a lot of time in this hospital. But even when she was sickest, she'd explain medical terms to other kids. Try to make them less scared. Like you did with me. Like you do now. Charles smiled. She would have loved you. Sarah touched the photo gently. The fund, it's not just helping me, you know. There are 15 other mentorship graduates starting medical school this year. I know. And next year, 20 more. I know that too. Sarah pinned her old volunteer badge next to her new resident ID. Full circle, she said softly. Just then, their pagers beeped, emergency in pediatrics. They rushed upstairs together, doctor and mentor, past and future merging with each step. In the pediatric ward, a young boy was having an asthma attack. Sarah took charge immediately, her voice calm and sure. Hey buddy, I know you're scared. But guess what? See that butterfly mural? It's magic. Want to know why? As she worked, telling stories and explaining procedures, Charles stepped back and watched. In her gentle hands, her careful explanations, her natural empathy, he saw everything medicine should be. The boy's breathing eased. His mother, who'd arrived panicked and breathless, relaxed as Sarah explained the treatment plan in simple terms. You're really good with kids, the mother said. Sarah smiled. I had an excellent teacher. She caught Charles' eye. Still do. Later, they sat in the cafeteria, sharing coffee like they had so many times before. But now they sat as colleagues, equals in the profession they both loved. You know, Sarah said, that girl today, Maria? She asked about becoming a doctor. Charles laughed. Of course she did. I gave her my card. Told her about the mentorship program. Sarah grinned. The cycle continues. Outside, the rain had stopped. Dawn was breaking over the city, painting the hospital windows in gold. Ready for your first full day as a resident? Charles asked. Sarah stood, straightening her white coat. Ready to change the world. 5 years into her residency, Sarah stood at a podium in St. Michael's main conference room. The audience included hospital staff, community members, and most importantly, 30 children in white coats, the newest class of mentorship students. 10 years ago, I was where you are now, she began. Scared, uncertain, but dreaming big. Today, I want to share what happened to that little girl in the rain. Charles sat in the back, now retired but still active in the program. His hair had gone completely white, his steps slower, but his eyes were bright as ever. Our family support initiative has helped over 2,000 families in its first year, Sarah continued. No child waits alone anymore. No parent has to choose between work and being with their sick child. And most importantly, no one gets turned away because they look like they don't belong. The program had transformed St. Michael's. Security guards now helped lost families find their way. Transport services ensured patients could reach their appointments. Community outreach programs brought medical education into underserved neighborhoods. But today isn't about numbers, Sarah said. It's about moments. Like when 8-year-old Maria, who came to us scared and alone 5 years ago, just got accepted into our mentorship program. Maria stood up, beaming in her white coat. Her father, now a patient advocate at the hospital, clapped proudly. It's about Tommy, one of our first mentorship graduates, starting his residency at Johns Hopkins. Sarah gestured to a young man in the audience. And Lisa, who's bringing our program model to hospitals in rural communities. The successes kept coming. Mentorship graduates entering medical schools across the country. New hospitals adopting their program. Lives changing, one interaction at a time. None of this would exist, Sarah's voice softened, without one doctor who stopped in the rain. Dr. Charles Thompson taught me that medicine isn't just about treating symptoms. It's about seeing people, really seeing them. Charles felt tears in his eyes as Sarah continued. The Emily Thompson Memorial Scholarship has now funded medical education for 50 students from underserved communities. Emily's spirit lives on in every one of us who wears this white coat. After the presentation, Charles found Sarah surrounded by mentorship students, answering questions with the same patience he'd shown her years ago. Dr. Williams, a small boy asked, "Is it true you were really scared to come into the hospital at first?" Terrified, Sarah admitted. But sometimes the scariest moments lead to the best changes. Later, in Charles' old office, now Sarah's, they shared coffee like they had thousands of times before. "Hard to believe it's been 15 years, Sarah said, touching the framed photo on her desk, her 8-year-old self with Charles, both in white coats. "Harder to believe you're running the place now," Charles chuckled. "Only the mentorship and community programs. For now." She grinned. "Give me time." A knock interrupted them. Maya entered, now the hospital's director of patient services. "Emergency downstairs," she said. "Young girl, looks about 8. Reminds me of someone." Sarah grabbed her coat. "Coming, Dr. Thompson. I'm retired. Remember? You'll never retire from teaching me." They found the girl in the ER waiting room. Her story was familiar. Sick parent. No transportation. Scared and alone. But this time, the system worked differently. Security had already called patient services. A social worker was arranging transportation for the family. And Sarah knelt down, just as Charles had done for her, offering not just medical care but understanding. "Want to know something cool about hospitals?" she asked the girl. Charles watched Sarah work, seeing in her all the best parts of medicine: compassion, wisdom, and the courage to change what needed changing. Later, he found her in the pediatric ward, showing a group of mentorship students the butterfly mural. "This is where I learned about white blood cells," she was saying. Dr. Thompson called them the body's army. The students scribbled in their notebooks, just as she had once done. Each one represented another barrier broken, another dream made possible. "Dr. Williams," a nurse approached. "The board approved your proposal. The new pediatric wing will break ground next month." Sarah's face lit up. "Did they approve the name?" "Yes. The Emily Thompson Pediatric Center." Charles steadied himself against the wall. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Is that okay?" she asked softly. "I wanted her legacy to keep growing." "It's perfect," he whispered. That evening, they walked through the hospital together one last time before Charles' official retirement party. Every corner held memories. Their first meeting in the rain, her first diagnosis, countless teaching moments. "You know," Sarah said, "I looked up the meaning of Thompson once. It means son of Tom, but I think it really means person who stops in the rain." Charles laughed. "Getting philosophical in your old age. Learn it from the best." She stopped at the hospital entrance. "I have something for you." She handed him a frame. Inside was her original drawing. The 2 stick figures under an umbrella, alongside a new one drawn by Maria, showing 3 figures: Charles, Sarah, and a young girl in a white coat. "The cycle continues," Sarah said softly. At the retirement party, hundreds gathered to celebrate. Staff members, former patients, mentorship students past and present. But Charles' eyes kept finding Sarah, seeing both the scared girl from the rain and the powerful doctor she'd become. "Remember what you told me once?" she asked during his speech. "That nothing worthwhile is ever easy." "I remember. You were right. But you forgot to mention the best part. We don't have to do it alone." As the party wound down, they found themselves back at the hospital entrance where it all began. Rain fell softly outside. "Full circle," Charles said. Sarah opened an umbrella. "Need a walk home?" Dr. Thompson. "Lead the way." Dr. Williams. They stepped into the rain together, mentor and student, father and daughter in all but blood, their legacy living on in every child who would never have to wait alone in the rain again. Behind them, the hospital lights glowed warmly, and somewhere inside, another young doctor was stopping to help someone in need, continuing the cycle of compassion that had started with one simple choice on a rainy day 15 years ago.